The stray stars Mark had always believed that space was both a curse and a blessing for men like him, because it gave him freedom, but also left him in silence that gnawed at his bones. And on that particular night, as his small freighter drifted near the outer trade routes of the rim, he thought his biggest worry would be the failing stabilizer on his cargo hold or the unpaid docking fees that waited for him on the next station. He had no idea that his life was about to change forever when the signal came, faint and irregular, a distress beacon that most pilots would ignore because everyone knew derelict ships in that region usually meant traps set by pirates or scavengers. But Mark was not most pilots, and despite the risk he changed his course and followed the signal through the darkness of space where stars glimmered like cold eyes watching from an endless void. The ship he found was little more than a husk floating. Without power, its hull scarred by plasma fire and its rotation slow and sickly. No signs of life came from the scanners, no active energy signatures, only silence and the mechanical heartbeat of the emergency beacon that had been running far too long. Against every rule drilled into freighter captains, he decided to board. Not out of greed, but out of the stubborn curiosity that had always guided him since the day he left Earth. The airlock fought him before it gave way. And as he stepped inside the derelict vessel, he felt as if he was walking into the ghost of a once living creature. Its corridors dark and broken, the smell of burnt metal still clinging to the walls. He moved slowly through the wreck, light from his visor cutting the blackness into narrow beams. And though he expected to find nothing but bodies, he froze when he heard a sound so faint he thought his mind was playing tricks. It was not mechanical or electronic. It was the sound of breathing, quick and uneven, hidden somewhere deeper within. He followed it past shattered doors and flickering panels until he reached a storage bay, and there he found them. Two small figures crouched inside a cracked cargo pod, their eyes glowing faintly with bioluminescent light, their skin marked with thin patterns that pulsed softly like embers. They were children, though clearly not human, and the moment they saw him, they recoiled, clutching each other tightly as if the universe itself had come to tear them apart. Mark did not move too quickly, for he had seen fear before, the kind that left scars deeper than wounds, and these children wore that fear on their faces. He lowered his tool pack, raised his hands to show he carried no weapon, and spoke gently, though he knew they would not understand his language. His voice, however, carried tone more than words, and after a long pause, one of the twins leaned forward slightly, studying him with eyes that glowed brighter the longer they stared. He noticed they were weak, their breaths shallow, their limbs trembling from hunger and exhaustion. He understood then that if he left them there, no one would come, and the ship would drift until it was swallowed by the void, their small bodies turning to dust among the stars. There was a rule in spacefaring law that every captain knew by heart: when you find survivors of alien origin, you must report immediately to the nearest station where authorities decide their fate. Mark thought about that rule as he looked at the twins, about the bureaucracy that would take them, label them, maybe study them, maybe worse. He remembered the silence of his own childhood after he had lost his family on Earth, the way no one had come to take his hand when he had needed it most. That memory, still sharp after all those years, made his decision before his mind could protest. He reached into the pod slowly and extended a hand. The children hesitated, then one reached out with shaking fingers, brushing against his glove, and in that moment he knew he could never turn them over. He carried them back through the wreck, one clinging to his arm while the other walked close by, their glowing patterns lighting the way more surely than his visor beam. Once inside his freighter, he gave them blankets, food from his emergency supplies, and water which they drank as if they had been wandering a desert. They did not speak, though their eyes followed him with strange intensity, and when he tried to leave the cabin to let them rest, they whimpered softly until he returned. That night he sat in the pilot chair with the stars spread out like endless fields of ice and wondered what he had just done. News traveled fast across trade routes, and in the following days, Mark began to hear whispers on station coms about a missing royal line, about heirs who had vanished when a powerful alien throne was overthrown, about fugitives who were worth more alive than dead. He ignored most of it, focusing on keeping the children fed and comfortable. But he could not ignore the way strangers at ports began asking questions about unusual passengers or glowing children seen in back alleys. He told himself it was only coincidence. Yet every time the twins looked at him with trust, he felt a weight pressing on his chest. One evening, as his freighter drifted in silent cruise mode, he found the children near the observation window, their hands pressed to the glass, as if they were trying to touch the stars themselves. The patterns on their skin glowed brighter than ever, pulsing in rhythm with something unseen, like a heartbeat that belonged not to them but to the universe. He watched, uneasy and fascinated, until the light faded and they turned to him, eyes wide and unspoken meaning hidden behind their silence. He had taken them in without question, but deep down he knew they carried a story larger than anything he had ever touched in his lonely life. And whether he wanted it or not, that story had already begun to change his path. When he lay down to sleep that night, he told himself he was only a freighter pilot, a man drifting between ports, carrying cargo and debts, nothing more. Yet in the quiet hum of the ship he could hear their breathing in the next cabin, steady and fragile, and he knew that whatever dangers lurked ahead, he would face them. Because sometimes the universe chose people not for what they wanted, but for what they were willing to protect. And Mark, whether he admitted it or not, had already become more than a pilot. He had become the father of 2 children who had no one else, children who would soon draw the attention of powers far greater than anything he had ever faced, though he could not yet see how close that storm had already come. The silent bond life aboard a freighter was never meant for children, and Mark knew that from the moment he brought the twins onto his ship. Yet, day after day, he tried to turn that steel cage into something warmer, because whenever he looked at their small faces he saw how fragile they were and how much they needed him more than he needed anyone in years. He cleared one of the storage cabins that once held spare parts and made it into a sleeping place with blankets spread across the floor and lights kept low so their glowing markings would not be hidden, for they seemed calmer when their natural light filled the room. At first they barely moved from each other's side, sitting close together with wide eyes watching him as though he might vanish at any moment. But slowly the silence began to soften, and little by little they stepped closer, touched the things he gave them, and began to explore. Teaching them to eat was its own trial, because their kind had never seen human food before, and Mark had no idea what would harm them, so he tested carefully with small portions, keeping close watch as they chewed. Uncertainly, but soon enough they discovered a taste for fruit bars and warm broth from the ship's dispenser. When they ate, their eyes shone brighter, and sometimes they giggled in sounds so strange and sweet that Mark felt the long corridors of his freighter fill with a life it had never known. He did not understand their language, and they did not yet understand his, but words were not the only bridge between hearts, and they began to communicate through gestures, smiles, and the way their small hands would tug at his sleeve whenever they wanted his attention. The bond grew quickly, stronger than he had expected, and before long they followed him wherever he went, climbing into the co-pilot's chair while he worked, pressing buttons they should not touch but laughing when alarms chimed and Mark pretended to scold them. They seemed to learn faster than human children, repeating his words with strange accents, and within weeks they had begun calling him a simple sound that carried the weight of family. They called him father, not in his tongue but in theirs. And though the word was unfamiliar, the meaning struck him deeply. It had been years since anyone had spoken to him with such trust, and he felt something stir inside that he thought had long been buried. Yet, the universe never allowed joy without shadows, and Mark soon noticed things that unsettled him. The children's glowing markings changed with mood, and sometimes with no reason at all, pulsing in patterns that made the ship's sensors flicker, as if the energy within them disturbed the electronics. Once, when a door refused to open, the twins pressed their hands against the panel, and the lock slid aside, though no power was running to the system. Mark pretended it was coincidence, but he knew better. He had seen enough strange things in his years among the stars to recognize when something defied explanation. The twins were not ordinary orphans, and each day it became harder to ignore the truth that they carried something far greater than childhood innocence within their small bodies. Rumors across the rim confirmed his unease. Docking ports buzzed with talk of lost heirs from a fallen empire. Children stolen away during a coup that left an entire people under the rule of a usurper. Bounty hunters whispered of rewards so large that even the poorest scavenger could live like a king if they delivered the fugitives alive. Mark listened but kept his head down, telling himself that such stories belonged to someone else. Yet every time the twins looked at him with eyes brighter than the stars, he felt the cold fear of recognition. Perhaps they were the very children everyone sought. Perhaps the universe had placed them in his path for a reason he was not ready to face. His fear turned real one night as they crossed a quiet sector. Mark sat at the controls half asleep when he caught a strange pulse across the comm system, a broadcast so faint it barely registered. Yet the twins stirred instantly in their cabin, their markings glowing in rhythm with the signal. They ran to the cockpit and pressed their faces to the glass, as if answering a call only they could hear. Mark froze as the lights across his console flickered, and the signal grew stronger for a moment, before vanishing into the void. The twins turned to him with faces full of wonder, trying to explain in gestures what he could not understand. But all he saw was the truth he had been avoiding. They were linked to something vast, something powerful, and he was caught in its current. Days later at a fueling station, he felt the weight of suspicion for the first time. A merchant looked too long at the children, his eyes narrowing as if recognition stirred in him. And though Mark paid quickly and left, he sensed danger close behind. He rerouted his course, avoiding busy trade lanes, traveling through regions where few ships passed, but in his gut he knew he could not run forever. Still, he kept the children close, teaching them every day, showing them the stars on navigation maps, telling stories of Earth and the seas he had once seen as a boy. They listened with wide eyes, resting their heads against his arm, and in those quiet hours he allowed himself to forget the danger, to simply be the father they believed him to be. But destiny had its own pace. One evening as he sat with them in the cabin, the ship shuddered with a sudden jolt, alarms screaming as proximity sensors detected another vessel dropping from faster than light speed, too close for chance. Mark rushed to the cockpit and saw the silhouette of a hunter craft on his screen, small but armed, its transponder silent. He knew at once what it meant. They had been found. His stomach clenched with dread as he prepared to maneuver, his hand tightening on the controls, while behind him the twins stood together with markings flaring brighter than he had ever seen. For the first time he saw fear in their eyes, not of him, but of the ones outside. And in that moment he swore he would never let them be taken. The freighter engines roared as he pushed the ship into evasive patterns, trying to outrun a hunter, far faster and better armed. And though he knew the odds were against him, something inside refused to surrender. He was only one man with a worn ship and two frightened children, yet that was enough, for in the heart of the void he had finally found a reason to fight. And as the hunter closed in, broadcasting demands he ignored, Mark felt the story of his life twist into something larger than survival. He had taken in two children without knowing who they were. But now he could sense the truth pressing closer, a truth that would force him to choose not just between law and love, but between obscurity and destiny. The chase had begun, and deep down Mark understood that the silent bond he had formed with the twins was about to be tested against the ruthless will of empires. The hidden, crowned the hunter ship pressed harder on their trail, weaving through empty space with precision that betrayed long practice. And Mark's freighter shook with every maneuver as alarms screamed across the cockpit. He fought the controls, his jaw set, sweat running across his brow as the twins clung to their seats, their glowing patterns pulsing in fear. The hunter craft was faster and sleeker, built for pursuit, while his freighter was nothing more than a patched vessel meant to haul cargo and scrape past docking inspectors. Yet Mark refused to give up, turning sharply through asteroid fields, using every trick he had learned over years of running low-profit jobs through dangerous routes. His ship groaned but endured, and though the hunter closed in again and again, somehow he stayed ahead long enough to find a narrow channel of rock and ice where sensors often failed. He dived into it with engines roaring, and silence fell as the hunter lost sight, its signals fading behind the massive walls of stone. For hours he hid there, engines on minimal power, lights dimmed, heart pounding as he waited for the danger to pass. The twins sat close beside him, their small hands gripping his arm, their glowing eyes fixed on him with trust so deep it almost broke him. When at last the hunter's signals vanished, he slumped in his chair, his body shaking from the effort. And in that quiet moment, he understood the truth he had been avoiding. They were not safe anywhere. Something larger than his ship, larger than his life, was hunting them, and he needed answers before the storm swallowed them all. Later, when the children slept curled together under blankets in their small cabin, Mark opened the freighter's ancient archives and searched through the broadcasts he had ignored for weeks. He found reports and fragments, stories of an empire that had ruled half a sector, stories of betrayal and blood, of a palace stormed by traitors, of a royal family slaughtered except for 2 children who had vanished into the void. Their names were whispered with reverence, their survival denied by officials yet repeated by rebels who still fought in shadows. The descriptions were vague, but Mark needed no words to know the truth. He only had to look at the glowing markings on the twins' skin to see that they were the heirs the galaxy whispered about, the last hope of a fallen throne. He closed the archive with a heavy hand, his mind spinning with fear and disbelief. He had taken them in because they were helpless, not because they were royalty. Yet now the weight of their lives pressed on his shoulders like the gravity of a world. If the usurpers found them, they would be executed to erase the bloodline forever. If the rebels found them, they would be raised as symbols of war. And if the authorities discovered them aboard his freighter, he would be branded a kidnapper and traitor. No path led to safety, yet in his heart he knew only one truth: he would not let them go. They were his children now, no matter what titles. Their blood carried. The next day, as they traveled once more along the quieter lanes of space, the twins began to show him pieces of themselves that spoke of their hidden past. They sat by the navigation table and traced star patterns with their glowing fingers, pointing to clusters Mark had never visited. And when he asked simple questions, they answered with gestures that seemed to mark them as memories, not maps. He realized they were showing him their home, the world they had lost, and though they had no words in his tongue, the sorrow in their eyes was unmistakable. One of them touched the center of the map and pressed his small hand against Mark's chest, as if to say, "You are our home now." The gesture made his throat tighten, and he had to look away to keep his voice steady. But the universe was not finished testing them. At the next station, while he bartered quietly for supplies, Mark felt eyes watching him again, sharper and more suspicious than before. A group of mercenaries sat in the corner of the docking hall, their armor scratched but their weapons clean, and he saw how they studied every face that passed as if searching for someone. He kept his head low, hurried the children back to the freighter, and left before they could be questioned. But he knew word had already spread. The bounty was real, and every hunter in the sector was now chasing the prize. That night, as they drifted through deep space, Mark confronted the twins gently, asking them who they really were. He did not expect them to answer, yet to his surprise they pressed their glowing hands together, closed their eyes, and the cabin lights dimmed as if the energy of the ship bent toward them. Images formed in the air, faint and wavering, but clear enough to see: a great palace of shining towers, a throne of crystal, a woman with markings like theirs holding them close before soldiers stormed the halls, fire and screams filling the sky. The image shattered as the children whimpered, clinging to him as tears streamed down their small faces. Mark held them tightly, whispering comfort. He barely believed himself, and in that moment, his fear gave way to something stronger. They had shown him the truth not with words but with memory. They were indeed the lost heirs of a fallen empire, and the universe would never stop hunting them. As days passed, he began to plan, not with the mind of a simple pilot, but with the heart of a father who had something worth dying for. He modified the freighter with what little he had, rerouting power systems, shielding sensors, preparing hidden compartments where the twins could hide if boarders came. He taught them simple commands in English, words that might help in emergencies, and drilled them gently until they could follow instructions, even when frightened. The more he prepared, the more he realized how little stood between them and the endless reach of the usurper's forces. But preparation was all he had. The turning point came when a message arrived on an open channel, a distorted voice speaking across static, saying that the heirs were alive and whoever sheltered them would be destroyed. The transmission was short, but it froze Mark's blood, because it meant the hunt was no longer secret, it was public. The usurpers were not only searching but warning the galaxy, daring anyone to stand in their way. Mark switched off the comm, but he could not erase the sound of those words, and when he looked at the twins curled together in their cabin, he knew that the storm had drawn closer than ever. He told himself again and again that he was only a freighter pilot, nothing more. Yet as he stood at the observation window with the twins beside him, their glowing faces reflecting against the stars, he felt something awaken inside that was stronger than fear. He was their father now, by choice if not by blood, and if the galaxy demanded he surrender them, he would answer with everything he had. The hidden crown they carried might belong to an empire, but the bond they shared belonged to him, and no force in the void would take it without a fight. The relentless chase, the freighter had become more than a ship for Mark. It was now a shelter, a fragile shield against a galaxy that seemed to close in from all directions. And yet, no matter how carefully he charted hidden routes or how cautiously he moved from station to station, the whispers followed. Everywhere he stopped, people spoke of the bounty with hungry eyes, and though he kept the twins hidden behind thick doors and shadowed cabins, he knew the secret could not last forever. Because gold and power had ways of turning even kind faces into threats. The children felt the pressure too, their markings glowing more often with unease, their laughter shorter and their eyes watching the stars as if waiting for a storm to break. And Mark felt his heart tighten each time he saw that fear in them. Because children should not know what it means to run for their lives. Still he pressed on, teaching them more words in his tongue, giving them small tasks on the ship so that they could feel useful and less afraid, and each day he grew more certain that they were learning faster than any human child could, as though the blood of rulers carried knowledge along with duty. They navigated maps with skill, learned to recognize warnings on the console, even managed to reset circuits under his watchful eye. And Mark felt both pride and sorrow because they deserved a childhood of play, not survival lessons. Yet survival was all the universe had left for them, and he would not fail them no matter what it cost. One night as they traveled along a silent stretch of unmarked space, a faint light appeared on the scanner, too small for a warship, but steady enough to be real. Mark's pulse quickened as he magnified the view and saw a cargo vessel drifting without motion, its beacon flashing distress. Normally he would have approached with caution, but every lesson of the past weeks told him this could be a trap laid for fools who still believed in kindness. He adjusted his course to avoid it, but as he turned away, a sharp signal burst across the cum, not words, but a pulse of sound that made the twins leap from their seats. Their markings flared as if answering the call, and before Mark could shut the channel, the signal repeated again and again. His blood ran cold, because he knew then the trap was not meant for any ship. It was meant for them. He pushed the engines hard, ignoring the alarms that screamed about overheating, and the freighter leapt forward just as shadows tore out of the void behind them. 3 hunter crafts emerged, sleek and sharp like blades, weapons hot and targeting systems locked. The chase began without mercy, energy fire streaking past his hull as he twisted the ship into desperate maneuvers, the children clinging to their seats with wide, terrified eyes. The freighter was slower, weaker, but Mark knew every trick of survival, and he forced the vessel into narrow channels between asteroid belts, using debris to block scanners, using bursts of speed only when necessary. For hours the pursuit dragged on until his body ached and his vision blurred. But still the hunters pressed closer, herding him toward a sector he recognized too late as a dead-end dot when the first blast tore across his shields and the ship shuddered with the impact. Mark thought it was the end, but then the twins rose from their seats, their markings blazing with light so bright it filled the cockpit, their small hands pressed to the walls as if they could speak to the ship itself. The console flickered, alarms silenced, and suddenly the freighter surged forward with a burst of speed it had never possessed. Mark stared in disbelief as the hunters fell back, unable to match the sudden force, and for a brief shining moment, they escaped into the dark. But when the light faded, the twins collapsed, their energy drained, their small bodies trembling with exhaustion, and Mark gathered them in his arms with fear gripping him tighter than any hunter's weapon. He understood then that their power was real, a gift or a curse he could not comprehend, but it came at a terrible cost, one that could destroy them if he allowed them to bear it too often. Shaken and desperate, he sought refuge at a remote station, where he knew an old friend, a mechanic named Tomas, a man who had once shared long voyages and drinks with him in younger days. Tomas welcomed him with a smile, listened to his story with patient silence, and offered him repairs and supplies without asking for credits. For a moment, Mark believed he had found a safe harbor, a place to breathe. But deep down he knew safety was a dream too fragile to last. That night, as the twins slept in the cabin and Mark closed his eyes for the first real rest in weeks, Tomas sent a message across the dark, his voice low but steady, telling the hunters that the prize they sought was aboard his friend's freighter. Betrayal came swiftly at dawn when heavy boots shook the docking bay and mercenaries stormed the hangar, their weapons gleaming under harsh lights. Mark woke to the sound of alarms, his instincts driving him forward before his mind could catch up. He grabbed the twins and raced toward the ship, his voice urging them to run, their small feet pounding against the steel floor. Shots rang out, sparks flying as bullets tore into walls, but Mark did not stop, shoving them into the freighter and sealing the hatch just as explosions rocked the bay. He cursed Tomas with every breath, not for greed, but for the wound it left in his chest, because betrayal cut deeper when it came from someone once trusted. Engines roared to life as the freighter tore from the station, mercenary ships rising in pursuit, and once again the void became a battlefield of light and fire. Mark fought with everything he had, using the station's structures as cover, weaving through beams and towers while the twins huddled close, their eyes wide with fear. He knew he could not outrun them forever, not this time, but surrender was not in his blood. He turned the freighter into a storm of maneuvers, risking every trick, forcing the hunters to collide with debris, until one by one they fell back. But the cost was heavy, his ship battered, engines screaming, shields nearly gone, and as the stars stretched before him in silent witness, He realized the chase would never end until the truth was faced. When the alarms finally quieted and the children fell asleep against his arms, Mark sat in the cockpit staring into the dark and knew the choice ahead of him. He could keep running until the void swallowed them, or he could face the galaxy with the truth, show the universe that the heirs were alive, and take whatever storm followed. The thought chilled him but also gave him strange strength, because for the first time he saw not only fear in their survival but hope. They were not just children, not just a burden. They were symbols of a future that others would fight for, if they only knew the truth. And as the freighter drifted in silence with its lights dimmed and its captain lost in thought, Mark whispered, a vow to himself, a vow that no betrayal, no empire, no army would take them from him, and that he would carry them, not just as children of fate, but as his own, no matter what crown or throne the universe demanded of them. The dark space around Mark's freighter was filled with silence. After the ambush, the ship floated like a wounded beast drifting helplessly as the lights flickered and the engines coughed sparks outside. Heavy warships closed in, their weapons glowing with a deadly light ready to fire at any moment. The children clung to Mark, their glowing markings pulsing with fear. He felt their small hands tighten around his arm, and in their frightened eyes he saw not only the terror of losing, but the hope that he would not let go of them, and it made his heart beat faster because he knew he had no choice. He had to fight, not just with guns, but with something stronger. Inside the control room, alarms screamed and smoke filled the air. Mark pulled himself to the console, his hands shaking yet steady in their purpose. He opened the communication channels across the sector. The Empire had tried to keep everything hidden, but he would break that wall. He activated the ship's old broadcast system and turned on every frequency available. He whispered to the twins to stand beside him to show themselves, because if the galaxy was to believe, they must see not only him, but them together. The screen lit up. Millions of receivers across colonies and stations caught the signal. Civilians, soldiers, traders, miners, and wanderers saw the picture of a beaten human pilot with two children standing at his side, their glowing marks unmistakable, their faces filled with fear and courage. The sight was enough to spread shock and whispers through every corner of space. Mark's voice cut through the air, raw but steady. He told the galaxy who the twins were. He told of the fall of their family, the betrayal, the occupation, and how they had been hunted like prey. He told of his discovery of them, hidden on a broken ship. He told how they were not weapons, not prizes, not pawns, but children, innocent and rightful heirs whose only crime was being born into a throne others wanted to steal. Warship commanders hesitated, their fingers hovering over triggers, but their crews froze as they too listened. Messages spread like wildfire across fleets and cities. The truth could no longer be hidden, and those who had bowed in silence now felt their chains weaken. Twins stepped forward, their small hands gripping Mark's coat, their markings glowing brighter. They spoke together, their voices trembling yet strong. They said they were the children of the true line, and though they were young, they would not run anymore. They would claim what was theirs, but not through blood or fear. They promised a different rule, one that remembered kindness, one that remembered humanity. For they declared before all that their father was not only of their blood, but of their choice, and they looked at Mark when they said it. Tears blurred Mark's vision, yet his voice stayed strong. He told them that he was just a man, a lonely pilot, who once had nothing but a rusting ship. Yet when he found these children, he found a reason to fight. He told the galaxy that humans were seen as weak or reckless, but that humanity's true strength was its stubborn heart, its refusal to give up. Even when cornered, he said if anyone tried to harm the twins again, they would have to fight not only a beaten human, but a spirit that never broke. The silence after his words was vast. Then across the channels voices rose. Rebellion awakened. Fleets loyal to the fallen line turned their guns around civilians, marched against governors. Mercenaries once chasing credits now questioned who truly had the right to rule. The empire began to crack, not with fire from Mark's ship, but with truth poured into the hearts of its people. The warships surrounding Mark wavered one by one, their lights dimmed and their weapons powered down. Some ships even turned away, their captains refusing to fire upon the Heirs. The children's glow spread like a beacon across the sky, as if the stars themselves had chosen sides. Mark's ship limped free, guided by allies who answered the call. Not all battles were over, but the tide had turned. The Empire could no longer claim silence, they could no longer erase the Heirs, and though danger still lived in the shadows, hope now burned brighter. Later, in a great hall of a liberated station, the twins stood before crowds, both alien and human, banners of rebellion hanging above their heads. They were crowned not with gold, but with the trust of those watching. They declared they would rebuild, not as rulers above, but as leaders among. They promised no more hidden children, no more hunted families, no more silence. When asked who had guided them, they turned and pointed to Mark, the man who had given them shelter when the galaxy abandoned them. They called him Father. Before all they said his wisdom would shape the new empire. They placed a medallion of light upon him, though he never asked for it, and the people cheered. Mark stood quiet in that moment, his hands heavy, his heart overflowing. He had not dreamed of power, he had only wanted to protect two frightened children, but now he saw how far that choice had traveled, across stars and across lives. And he realized that sometimes one act of humanity could change empires. Years later, tales spread of the day when a human pilot revealed the truth to the galaxy, when two orphaned children spoke with courage, and when the old empire fell not with fire, but with hope. And in every corner, when people whispered those stories, they remembered the simple words of a man who once drifted alone in space, but who found a family and a purpose. And so the children who were once lost became rulers with hearts open wide, and the man who had nothing became the father of an empire. Together, they shaped a future where humanity and aliens stood side by side, not as strangers but as kin, and the stars that had once seemed cold now glowed warm with the promise of a new beginning. The story had started with loneliness and fear, but it ended with unity and hope, and above all it showed that sometimes the smallest choice to protect life could echo through the galaxy, louder than any weapon and stronger than any crown. The end.